Right. As the title here suggests, I'm going to be talking about Canada's role in innovation and access to tackle future global challenges. And while most of my presentation is going to be about access to medicines, I appreciate today has been touching on some other global challenges, particularly climate change. And I know you've heard from some of my MSF colleagues on that issue earlier today. So as I'm talking, in the back of your mind, please do be thinking about, how would we extrapolate some of these approaches to other technologies, other innovations to mitigate climate change, to prevent climate change, and also potentially are there issues in the way that we silo some of these issues like access to medicines and climate change and other environmental tech, in ways that inhibits us from actually finding some of these commonalities in bridging innovation and access? So, this gap between innovation and access really underscored by COVID-19. So some real triumphs in terms of, innovation in record time, when we actually back up innovation with, enough resources in terms of developing these tools. But, in terms of making sure those tools got to everyone who needed them, we really fell short. Something underscored by the Secretary General of the UN, talking about how we passed the science test, but we got an F in ethics. And Canada has been a bit of a microcosm in this conversation, where Canada said a lot of nice things about equitable access, but those haven't been really reflected in its actions. And in fact, as I'll be coming to, I will put to you that Canada has actually learned some of the wrong lessons from COVID-19. So, vaccine equity is something I've spent a lot of time on the past few years. And just recapping, Canada is the country that said, again, a lot of nice things about equitable access, but at the same time secured the most doses per capita of any country in the world from a limited supply. Didn't do a very good job of sharing that supply. In fact, we've thrown away more vaccines than we ever shared. And in turn, actually, somewhat puzzlingly, actually inhibited some of the measures to make that global supply bigger, so that we have a bigger pie when we're taking such a big slice for ourselves. And it did this at a time that Canada had not, and in fact, to this day, still has not, produced any COVID vaccines of its own. So Canada itself is quite dependent on international supplies. So, Canada's approach to this, especially around issues of intellectual property and dissemination of innovation, has really not favored a lot of equitable access tools. That's been true in the negotiations of the so-called TRIPS waiver, which have in fact still been ongoing in the past week, underscoring wherever you stand on the issue, WTO is not a rapid response to a pandemic. And perhaps even more importantly, in the pandemic treaty, aka pandemic agreement, pandemic accord, that is currently under negotiation, and in theory, supposed to have a finalized text in May of this year, although we'll see. And particularly in its positions in the actual negotiations of this treaty, Canada has actually made some productive contributions in terms of including equity principles, recognizing marginalized groups and so on in the text. But at the same time that it's done that, it's actually been actively undermining actual tools to ensure equitable access to health products. This has been in areas like transparency, where Canada has tried to X out transparency around pharmaceutical pricing, around government subsidies to pharmaceutical companies. It's also been around issues of transfer of technology, from one producer to other producers who would like to supply the need, where Canada has really wanted this to always be on voluntary terms. As we have learned time and again, and well before COVID-19, quite simply, pharmaceutical companies quite frequently do not voluntarily share. And it makes little sense to be negotiating a treaty where that's what we're relying on, where there's no backstop for when that doesn't happen. So this is really reflected in a lot of Canada's recent policies around innovation and access, which have really emphasized things like intellectual property as an end in itself, as opposed to what IP like patents are intended to do, which is that they are an incentive. They're not the only potential one, but they're an incentive to innovate to the betterment of society. So we look at this example. This is from the proposed Canada Innovation Corporation, where we're talking about government support for things like potentially life-saving cancer therapeutics for an incurable cancer. Fantastic. That absolutely sounds like something a government should be investing in. Great. But when you read more closely, you see they're coming at it from a very particular angle. They're talking about this as a large global market opportunity. I'm going to come back to market in the context of pharmaceuticals. There's nothing in here about actually curing cancer. That in itself, that's awesome for society. That's great for Canada. That's great for the world. Let's ensure affordable access to this to accomplish that goal. That's not what they're talking about. Furthermore, this approach also underscores some of the weaknesses in Canada's approach, where Canada puts a lot of funding into things, not enough. We could always fund more, but into the basic research, the early steps, but then is very reliant on commercial interests to take things, to the finish line, and in turn, it is those corporate interests who profit off it and who sell back these products to countries like Canada and don't necessarily make them available elsewhere. And it's this public funding that's really key. Here's an example in the COVID context of the impact of public funding, and this is a conversation that's happening elsewhere, right? Other countries like the U.S. are talking about public funding as an investment, and what is the return for the public on that investment? And the U.S. actually does tie strings to funding. The big conversation in the U.S. right now around things like march-in rights and so on, are about actually pulling these strings that have actually existed, but haven't really been used. Whereas in Canada, we often really haven't tied these strings in the first place. And that's despite the fact that this has been recommended multiple times before and during COVID by, for example, House of Commons committees. Here we Foreign Affinity, talking about similar strings for global access, again, to funding. And we really haven't been doing this. So what are the impacts of this? We'll give an example. Some of you have probably heard about the WHO's mRNA Tech Transfer Hub in South Africa, right? Which is intended to disseminate mRNA vaccine tech throughout Africa. And Canada has supported this. We've written a number of checks. That's great, right? 45 million at this point. Fantastic. But here's the thing, is that in order to have any tech to transfer, this facility actually had to reverse engineer the vaccines because the pharmaceutical companies did not want to voluntarily transfer this technology. And so Canada's been funding this, the reverse engineering, but the thing is, some of the tech, the lipid nanoparticle tech underlying these vaccines, is already developed in Canada with public funding, first at UBC, of course, a public university, and then it was spun off into a for-profit company, who in turn also received public funding to develop this. But Canada hasn't tied strings to be able to say, you know what, it's a pandemic. We really need to transfer this technology, get it out there, increase access. And this is not to say, we're taking this technology away. This is not to say you don't get paid. I mean, that's how things won't get into compulsory licenses and so on. But you do get paid if you're the IP owner, you just don't get to exercise this control over saying we're not going to let others produce it. So let's step back a bit, talk about markets. Because we always talk about a drug coming to market, but market and patient, these aren't the same thing. And that's really been illustrated in things like antiretrovirals for HIV, where early on, these products were completely inaccessible to the countries, indeed the continent, that was most in need. And what often happens is, that pharmaceutical companies are looking at the market in terms of how much money they can make, not how many people they can serve. And this can actually have some interesting wrinkles. In Canada, like elsewhere, our regulatory system is based on keeping bad drugs out. It's not based on bringing good drugs in. So, in order to sell a drug in Canada, you have to show that that drug is safe, that drug is efficacious, and that drug meets quality standards, right? Safety, efficacy, quality. But of course, the first bit is in order to sell it. If you don't want to sell a drug, there's no real mechanism to actually get you to sell it. So we end up in situations like this, to give an Alberta example, where there's an emerging neglected tropical disease, NTD, in not particularly tropical, although a bit more these past couple of weeks, Edmonton, Alberta. Echinococcus multilocularis, a drug you'd really like to have when you've got cases of this, is albendazole. Albendazole is one of the most basic drugs in global health. In fact, I can quantify that. It is one of the 14 most basic drugs in global health. But it's not. Canada's not perceived as a major market for this drug, and so this drug has never been formally sold in Canada for human use. I do say human. If you're a cow, maybe a little different. But this is where we actually do have a treatment for an NTD. That whole concept of NTDs was developed to draw attention to the fact that drugs or diseases whose public health impact is much higher than their commercial potential, we often don't get drugs or vaccines or other tools for those diseases at all. We don't get them in the first place. It's a market failure because, again, it's about patients as opposed to the market. And, we've seen the impact of this in some cases where a disease that was being treated like that, suddenly does impact countries with market potential, rich countries like Canada. And we saw that quite recently with Mpox, right? Mpox been around for a while, number of endemic countries, but not until 2022 did we have this big global outbreak where it was affecting multiple countries. This is a bit of an interesting example because there actually already was a tool as a smallpox vaccine, which now is also indicated for Mpox. And countries, particularly, in fact, the US and Canada, were stockpiling this vaccine already for smallpox. And then when Mpox came around, countries like Canada bought a lot more of it, again, from a limited global supply. Meanwhile, same time we've had this global outbreak of Mpox, there's actually been a separate parallel outbreak in 2023 in Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, there's even newer numbers of this that are just coming out. The DRC outbreak in 2023 has had at least 3 times as many deaths as the entire global outbreak of Mpox. But DRC has never had any access to Mpox vaccine outside of some clinical trials and research studies. So we're starting to also see these imbalances where tools that are useful for tropical diseases are actually being primarily snapped up for biosecurity stockpiles. We're seeing this right now with the monoclonal antibody therapies for Ebola as well, which are almost all held by the U.S. So, what can we do about this? Where can we go with this? There's interesting research happening in Canada. There has been for a long time. At the National Microbiology Lab, the NML in Winnipeg, which is a government lab, we saw these very promising vaccine candidates, almost 20 years ago. But the problem is, as I was saying, that Canada is very reliant on commercial interests to finish the job. So these good vaccine candidates were developed by Canada, but then it licensed them out to commercial bodies. And at the time, in the 2000s, the company that received the license for the Ebola vaccine didn't see a market for it, and they stuck it on a shelf. Then didn't do anything with it until we saw the West African outbreak, 2013, 2014, where suddenly there was interest, and actually it got sub-licensed to another pharmaceutical company who did actually bring it to market. And you know what? It's a good vaccine. It's a Canadian vaccine, but it's also the most expensive vaccine that MSF uses. And this has all been because we're reliant on commercial potential as opposed to public health potential. And we've seen this again and again, even from the same lab. In fact, the same vaccine platform. We see Marburg there. Marburg, we see that popping up not that infrequently. Ebola Sudan, right? A different form of Ebola, where MSF was responding to a fairly large outbreak just over a year ago in Uganda. There was a vaccine candidate for that, but that's never managed to proceed. Similarly, Lassa fever is another one where that's got quite a large public health impact in some countries. It would be fantastic to have a Lassa fever vaccine, but unfortunately, we're reliant on the market. And as Ambassador Ray was saying earlier, sometimes he was saying it about housing, but it's true here. Sometimes we actually need to not rely on the market to fill those needs. So, what can we do about this? What steps can we take? Because there are other pieces of this puzzle. And, one story that often comes up in these sorts of tales is the story of Connaught Labs. So this is a manufacturer started just before the First World War. In Canada, it was supplying these products, all over the world. You can kind of see service to the empire gives you a bit of the date of this sort of thing. Labs also most famous, of course, for discovery of insulin, which also over a century ago at this point, and the story of how the patent for insulin was assigned for just $1 in order for that patent not to interfere with the ability to disseminate insulin. A little bit of trivia here, probably hard to read this, but you've got a really big screen. But actually the patent, it's not Benting and Best on a patent, it's actually Collip and Best. Anyway, little pub trivia for you there. But during COVID, we've had a bit of a cottage industry of these, op-eds saying, "Oh, if only the federal government hadn't privatized Connaught Lab in the '80s, Canada would have been producing its own COVID vaccines, and we would have avoided a lot of these problems." And that's a gross oversimplification. First of all, the federal government didn't actually own the labs until the '70s, and that was actually part of an explicitly for-profit Crown Corporation. There were also around that time a lot of questions about kind of the quality and so on of goods coming out of Connaught Labs. The facilities weren't as well kept up, etc. So, the moral of this particular story is that simply owning publicly owned facilities, that's not going to solve
We can't hear
facilities.
you. Oh.
Okay. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay. Does say my connection's wobbling. I'm sorry about that. That we once again have publicly owned facilities And we need to be asking more questions about, how can we actually use them to fill in these gaps that are not met by commercial interests. And unfortunately, that's not what we've been doing with the BMC in Canada. It has essentially, thus far, been used essentially as a subsidy to commercial companies. The only public deal with the BMC is with Novavax to produce the Novavax vaccine there, which, this facility was completed in 2021, fully licensed by 2022. Nothing's come off the assembly line. And at this point, Novavax is saying, well, we're hopeful we might actually produce some doses by 2024. You know what? There are other things that we could be producing. There are Canadian technologies that we even have the potential to go, end to end at this point, but we're not doing that. So, these are questions to ask. This is a session for a university. So, been mostly talking about government policy. Many of these concepts apply to university policy too. A lot of universities really keen on IP, not really thinking as much about the consequences of that. So this is the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, their global access report card for Canadian universities. I've been talking about UBC thus far, and UBC scores the best because UBC actually has global access principles. They just haven't really been following them. Whereas, Connaught Labs, before it was federal, that was at U of T. And as we see here today, U of T has a D minus, right? The gentleman's F. So, these approaches have shifted. We need to think about these sorts of things. You're at the university, U of A actually scoring relatively reasonably well. Some really exciting pharma things happening at U of A, but talk to the university. Ask, what if we're developing life-saving technologies? Isn't the point to save lives with them? Oh, and I've been talking very fast, so I can actually do my extra slide here. Another piece I do want to flag, because this often gets lost in the conversation, is we've been talking about new technologies and disseminating those. It's also important to maintain access to older technologies, even when they're no longer as high profile. The disease that Connaught Labs was actually founded to address is actually diphtheria. The first product that it ever made, that it was founded to make, was diphtheria antitoxin. So this is to treat diphtheria at a time when in Canada this was, in fact, in some age groups, the leading killer of kids in Canada. And this product previously had to be imported at very high price from the US. So this was to have a affordable product that in fact could be distributed for free in Canada. Diphtheria, now in countries like Canada, thanks to vaccination, it's largely disappeared. But when you've got diphtheria, it's very helpful to have the antitoxin. There's essentially very little production of it globally. So when it's needed, it's not there. And right now, we're seeing massive issues with diphtheria in MSF. The biggest wave of diphtheria that's ever been seen in Africa is underway, mostly in West Africa. Right now, we see it in conflict zones where vaccinations have been disrupted as well, places like Yemen, places like Myanmar. And currently, all the production of antitoxin that's coming off the line, WHO and MSF are using it all, and it's not remotely enough. And part of that's because it's also, it's a product that people don't think they can make money off of, and B, that's also partly because it's made in the same way that Connaught Labs used to make it. It's a horse serum. You need a bunch of horses, you plug it into them, and then you draw the serum. There's cool new tools like monoclonal antibodies that show a lot of potential to treat diphtheria, but again, not money making. So these early research tends to stall. These are the kinds of things that Canada could be filling the gaps in, end to end. And these are the kinds of soft power globally that Canada could be exerting once again, rather than inhibiting global supply of pharmaceuticals and then writing checks. I think I will end there.